Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time and place where the world seemed to turn to dust. So settle in. Let your room go quiet for a moment. Dim the lights. Take a deep breath. And picture yourself somewhere far away. Somewhere lonely. Somewhere where the wind never really stops blowing. Because tonight we're heading back to the Dust Bowl. Those years in the 1930s when the earth itself seemed to give up on humanity. It's not a glamorous chapter of history. There are no gleaming palaces here, no glittering royal banquets. Just dirt. Lots and lots of dirt. The kind that gets into your hair, your lungs, your dinner, your very soul. The Dust Bowl wasn't just one storm or one bad harvest. It was a slow disaster, stretching over nearly a decade. A combination of over-farming, poor soil management, and a once-in-a-century drought turned millions of acres of the American plains into something closer to a barren desert. The grass that had held the soil in place for thousands of years was gone, plowed under to make room for wheat. When the rain stopped coming, the wind took over. And once the wind had the topsoil, it didn't give it back. Imagine standing in your front yard one morning. You look up and see a wall of dust coming toward you, dark enough to block the sun. The chickens scatter. The dog hides on the porch. You run inside, stuff rags under the doors, wet towels for windows. And then you wait, listening to the wind howl like a freight train while dust pours through every crack and crevice. When it's over, the house will be full of fine, powdery dirt. It will coat the dishes. It will be in your bed. It will be in your lungs. You'll sweep it up only to do it all over again the next day. People called them black blizzards, and they weren't exaggerating. At the height of the Dust Bowl, some storms were so dark that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face at noon. Cars had to drive with headlights on in the middle of the day. Schools sometimes sent children home early so they wouldn't be trapped at the schoolhouse overnight, though sometimes they had to keep them there because it was too dangerous to travel. And yet, people stayed. This is the part that always amazes me. Even when it seemed impossible, when the air itself felt hostile, most families stayed. Maybe they had no choice. They were too poor to leave or had nowhere to go. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe after years of working the same piece of land, they just couldn't imagine leaving it behind. So life went on in its own grim way. Farmers still hitched up their horses and plowed, though sometimes the seeds blew away before they could take root. Mothers still cooked meals, even when the food tasted faintly of dust. People got used to waking up with grit in their teeth, used to covering their faces with damp cloths before stepping outside. There's something quietly heroic about that, though it probably didn't feel very heroic at the time. It just felt necessary. And of course, because people are people, they complained. They blamed one another. Some said the government wasn't doing enough. Others said the government was doing too much. Some blamed farmers for plowing up too much land. Others blamed the weather. Others blamed fate. And through it all, the wind kept blowing. Let's slow down here and take a closer look at a typical Dust Bowl town. Picture a small grid of wooden houses, a single main street with a church, a schoolhouse, a few shops, maybe a grain elevator, maybe a diner with coffee that never seems to stop percolating. In better times, these towns would have been lively. School plays, barn dances, church picnics. Now, everything feels muted. The paint on the houses is peeling. The windows are coated in dust. The sound of laughter is rare. On a windy day, the whole place feels like it's under siege. Dust seeps under the doors of the general store. It covers the candy jars, the canned goods, the checkerboard in the corner. Outside, a horse tied to the post has its eyes nearly shut against the grit. But life goes on. Inside one of those houses, a mother is hanging wet sheets over the windows to keep the dust out. Her children sit at the kitchen table, doing sums on their slates. The baby naps in a wooden cradle. Dinner is simmering on the stove, probably beans, maybe cornbread if there's flour to spare. The father comes in, sets his hat on a peg, and shakes the dust from his hair. He doesn't say much. People didn't waste a lot of words back then. He just sits, nods at his children, maybe asks if the well still has water. This was daily life. Not dramatic, not glamorous, but quietly grueling. And then when a storm rolled in, the routine changed. Everyone hurried to get inside. They closed the shutters, stuffed rags in the gaps, huddled together, and waited. You could hear the wind screaming around the house, feel the walls shudder. The baby might cry, the lamp might go out, but you waited because there was nothing else to do. When it passed, you swept up the dust. You shook out the sheets. You went back to life as usual. It's worth pausing to think about that mindset. Today, most of us expect life to be comfortable. If something breaks, we replace it. If the weather turns bad, we turn up the heat or the air conditioning. But in the Dust Bowl, there was no escape. There was no magic solution. You just endured one day at a time. So tonight, as you listen, let yourself imagine that kind of endurance. The patience it must have taken. The weariness. The tiny moments of hope, like when rain finally pattered on the roof after months of nothing. And now, let's pause and breathe together for a moment, because that was just the beginning. The worst years, the storms that blot out the sky, are still ahead of us. Would you have stayed if it were you? Or would you have packed a wagon and gone west, taking your chances somewhere greener? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know what you think. Let's drift onward, because if part one felt bleak, the next few years made it worse. The early 1930s have been dry, yes, but by 1934 the Great Plains were in full crisis. The rains didn't just fail, they seemed to vanish. Year after year, the soil grew drier. The winds blew stronger. The fields stopped producing anything worth harvesting. By 1935, people began to notice something strange about the sky. It wasn't just hazy anymore, it was alive. Great walls of dust, miles wide and thousands of feet tall, rolled toward the horizon like something out of a nightmare. People described them as if they were living creatures, black beasts crawling across the prairie, ready to swallow whole towns. And perhaps the most infamous of all those storms came on April 14th, 1935, the day history calls Black Sunday. It was a Sunday, naturally. Churchgoers had just gotten home. Children had just been shooed out to play. The morning had been calm, almost suspiciously calm. But by afternoon, the sky turned coppery red. The temperature dropped. And then it came, a rolling wall of dust so thick that witnesses said it looked like the end of the world. Some people ran inside just in time. Others were caught outdoors and had to crawl home on hands and knees, following fences by touch because they couldn't see a thing. Chickens smothered. Cars stalled. Entire herds of cattle simply vanished into the storm, only to be found later half buried in dunes of dirt. Inside the houses, it was no better. The air grew so thick that lanterns barely lit the room. Dust forced its way in through every gap. It got into the butter, the milk, the bread dough. People covered their faces with damp cloths and waited for the sound of wind to die. And here's where the human part of the story becomes strangely tender. Families huddled together, sometimes with neighbors who'd taken shelter with them. They told stories to pass the time. They sang hymns, recited Bible verses, or simply sat in silence, listening to the strange, otherworldly roar outside. Children grew up with this as normal. For them, the sight of a black sky and the taste of grit on their tongue was just part of life. They learned to run home quickly at the first sign of a storm. They learned not to cry when the family's meager supper had to be brushed off before they could eat it. Some families nailed damp flour sacks over their windows to try to keep the dust out. Others hung wet sheets in doorways, which at least caught some of the dirt before it entered the next room. Every morning brought the same routine: sweeping, shaking, dusting, until everything looked halfway normal again. And then, inevitably, the next storm undid all that work. And yet, they found ways to laugh. People joked that they didn't need curtains anymore. The dust covered the windows just fine. They joked that the only crop still growing was tumbleweed. They joked that they were getting used to eating a little soil with their supper. There's something about that kind of humor that feels familiar. Humans have always made jokes in bad times, not because it makes things better, but because it's the only way to make them bearable. But not everyone could keep laughing. As the years dragged on, people began to break. Some packed their wagons and left for good. Others stayed but grew quieter, more withdrawn. One farmer described feeling like the land had betrayed him. He had poured years of sweat into turning prairie grass into farmland, and now it seemed as though the earth was taking revenge. And yet, there were still moments of beauty. Some survivors remembered how eerie and strange the storms looked when the sun hit them just right. The black sky glowing orange at the edges, the fields looking like some surreal painting. Some children, when asked later, admitted that they thought the storms were exciting. They had never known a life without dust, so to them it was simply part of the landscape. Scary, yes, but also fascinating. There were also little victories. A crop that survived just long enough to be harvested. A rain shower that filled the stock tank. A healthy calf born after a long season of losses. Every one of those victories mattered because they meant you could go one more day, one more week without giving up, and the government began to notice. 2. The Soil Conservation Service was founded in 1935, trying to teach farmers new techniques. Contour plowing, crop rotation, leaving some fields fallow. To some farmers, this felt like meddling. To others, it was a lifeline. Change didn't happen overnight. The storms kept coming. But slowly, very slowly, the land began to heal, and the people began to learn how to live with it. So tonight, as you lie there, imagine sitting in that dark farmhouse, listening to the storm pass. Imagine the silence that follows, the world muffled under a blanket of dust. Would you have been the one cracking a joke, just to make your children smile? Or would you have sat quietly, just waiting for it all to be over? Tell me in the comments which one you think you'd be. The comforter, the joker, or the one staring silently at the wall. The storms did not last forever. They seemed like they would. There were years when people swore the sky had simply given up on them. But slowly, eventually, the rain returned. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic, Hollywood ending kind of way. Just a few more drops here, a good soaking there, then another and another. It took time for people to trust it. A single wet season didn't mean much. Families had been fooled before. They had planted crops after rare rainfall, only to watch them wither under the sun a month later. But after a few seasons, something shifted. The grass came back, tentatively, almost shy. The soil began to hold together. You could tell the land wanted to recover. It just needed help, and help did come from a most unlikely source. Washington, the federal government, for all its bureaucracy and red tape, did manage to do something remarkable during these years. They called it the New Deal, which sounded very official and optimistic, and in many ways it was. Men were put to work planting shelter belts, rows and rows of trees stretching for miles. These trees were not for decoration. They were a living fence, meant to break the wind and hold the soil in place. Imagine driving across a flat, endless prairie and seeing these straight green lines of trees, like a kind of miracle. The government taught farmers new ways to plow. 2. Instead of turning over the soil in neat, straight rows, which left it vulnerable, they learned to plow along the curves of the land, to plant cover crops that would hold moisture, to leave stubble behind after harvest, so the ground wouldn't be stripped bare. It was a hard sell for some. Farmers are not always quick to trust outsiders telling them how to work their own land. But when you've watched your entire farm blow away once, you're willing to try almost anything to keep it from happening again. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, built roads and schools, giving jobs to men who've been out of work for years. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, put young men to work building dams and terraces. Many of them sent their wages home to their parents, keeping whole families afloat. Life began to feel a little less desperate. Not easy, never easy, but less like the world was actively trying to kill you. For those who had stayed to the worst of it, there was a quiet pride. They had endured something that would become the stuff of history books. They had been shaped by it, weathered by it, sometimes hardened by it. For those who had left and were now returning, it was bittersweet. They came back to houses that had fallen into ruin, fields that had to be cleared again, fences that had collapsed. But they also came back to neighbors who were just as stubborn, just as determined to start over. Starting over meant more than just rebuilding barns or replanting crops. It meant replanting hope, too. It meant sitting around kitchen tables and talking about the future again. It meant children going back to school instead of working full-time just to help the family survive. It also meant learning to live with a memory of the storms. People would talk about them quietly, shaking their heads, telling the younger generation what it had been like. Some of those younger kids would roll their eyes, thinking it sounded exaggerated, until the next big wind came and they saw for themselves how fragile the land could be. By the early 1940s, the Great Plains looked very different. The shelter belts were growing tall. The soil was healthier. Wheat production was rising again. Some families even began to prosper. But the memory of those hard years never really left. Even decades later, when asked what they remembered most, survivors spoke of the sound of the wind, that endless, moaning wind that got into everything, that rattled windows, that made you wonder if it might blow forever. And maybe that memory was a good thing. It kept people from repeating the same mistakes. It reminded them to respect the land, to plant carefully, to save during the good years, so they can endure the bad ones. Sometimes we look back on history and think of it as inevitable, as though the Dust Bowl was always going to end exactly when it did. But to the people living through it, there was no guarantee. Every rainstorm felt like a gift, every green shoot of wheat like a small victory. Imagine standing there at the edge of a newly plowed field in 1942, watching your children play where just a few years ago there had been only blowing dust. Would you feel grateful? Or would you still be waiting for the next disaster just in case? Tell me in the comments, would you have trusted the rain or kept one eye on the horizon, always ready for the wind to rise again? When the rains finally returned, life on the Great Plains began to stabilize, but the people who had endured those years were changed forever. Hardship leaves its mark. The men and women who had lived through the Dust Bowl carried its memory with them, tucked somewhere deep in their bones. Some of them were just old enough, by the early 1940s, to find themselves called to war. The young men who had spent their teenage years watching storms rip apart their farms now put on uniforms and shipped off to Europe or the Pacific. It's hard not to wonder whether those years of deprivation made them a little tougher, a little more ready to face whatever came next. After all, when you've seen a wall of black dust coming at you across the horizon, storming a beach under enemy fire probably doesn't feel quite as unthinkable as it might to someone who grew up in comfort. Many of the women who stayed home went to work in factories. Rosie the Riveter was not just an abstract idea, but a reality for plenty of women who had once spent their days hanging laundry that immediately got coated in grit. They knew what it was to work hard with their hands, and they kept doing it for the war effort. Meanwhile, in California, the legacy of those who had come west during the worst of storms was shaping a whole region. The children of the Okies grew up in the Central Valley, working alongside their parents in the fields, sometimes resented by the locals, sometimes finding their place in a new community. California agriculture became one of the most productive in the world, and a lot of that labor force could be traced back to the dusty roads of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and beyond. If you drive through those farmlands today, you can still hear echoes of that migration, in the music, in the food, in the way people talk about where they came from. Back on the plains, farming didn't just go back to the way it had been before. People had learned some hard lessons. They planted more carefully now, leaving strips of grass between fields to hold the soil in place. They rotated crops. They treated the land with a little more respect, a little more caution. And yet, there was always that faint nervousness in the air, a memory you could taste on windy days. People saved money more carefully. They stocked up on flour and beans just in case. They taught their children not to waste food, not because they were thrifty by nature, but because they knew how quickly plenty could turn into scarcity. The Dust Bowl also left its mark on art and literature. Writers like John Steinbeck captured the heartbreak and dignity of those who had been forced to leave their homes. His novel The Grapes of Wrath became a classic not because it was about grand historical events, but because it told the story of ordinary people caught in forces bigger than themselves. Music changed, too. Folk songs turned into laments about lost farms and hard roads. Later, country music would carry those same themes of longing and survival, of packing up and heading somewhere new because there was nothing left where you were. There's a certain kind of American myth that came out of all this. The idea of picking yourself up by your bootstraps, of surviving anything if you just keep going long enough. That myth is complicated, of course. Not everyone made it through. Some people didn't recover financially, emotionally, or physically. But for those who did, there was a stubborn pride. The children and grandchildren of Dust Bowl survivors often say they grew up hearing the stories at the dinner table. They grew up knowing their family had been through something big, something that tested them, and that gave them a kind of identity. Even today, when the weather turns dry, you can hear echoes of those old fears. A single bad harvest can send a shiver down a farmer's spine, because somewhere in the collective memory of the plains, the Dust Bowl still lurks, reminding everyone what can happen when the rain stops and the wind starts to blow. And maybe that memory is a good thing. Maybe it keeps us humble. Maybe it keeps us from thinking we can bend nature entirely to our will. If you were part of that generation, would you tell those stories to your children, even if they rolled their eyes, or would you try to shield them from how bad it really was? Tell me in the comments. Would you be the storyteller keeping the memory alive, or the quiet parent hoping your kids never really understand what you went through? By the mid-1940s, the Great Plains looked deceptively calm. The skies were blue again. The fields were full of wheat that actually stayed where it was planted. New barns had been built, roads had been repaired, and towns that once looked half abandoned now had lights on in every house. If you were passing through as a stranger, you might not have guessed that a few years earlier the whole region had been on the brink of collapse. The dust still came sometimes. Always did. It was the prairie after all, but it was no longer the choking black blizzard that turned noon into midnight. Life slowly slipped back into its routines. Children went to school with books that weren't coated in grit. Mothers hung laundry on the line and didn't have to take it down 10 minutes later because the wind had turned it brown again. Community halls filled up on Saturday nights with dances and socials. Churches held potlucks where people brought casseroles instead of stories about which neighbor had lost their farm that week. There was laughter again, cautious at first, then louder, freer. But if you lived there, you knew the shadow hadn't completely lifted. There was a look in the eyes of people who had been through it, a kind of distant stare, like they were always watching the horizon just a little more carefully than everyone else. A big gust of wind could make a room go quiet. A dry year could send an entire town into a hush, as if no one wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. Psychologists would later call it generational trauma, but back then it was just called being cautious. People saved everything, buttons, twine, flour sacks, because they remembered when even those little things could mean the difference between getting by and going without. Children growing up in the late 40s and early 50s sometimes rolled their eyes at their parents' frugality. They couldn't understand why a single cracked teacup should be glued back together instead of replaced, why every scrap of paper should be used twice before being thrown away. They had never had to sweep piles of dust out of the kitchen 3 times a day. They had never had to wonder if there would be enough food for supper. For the parents, it wasn't just about the past. It was about preparing their kids for a future that might turn hard again. They didn't want them to be soft. They didn't want them to be caught off guard if the rain stopped one more time. This was the era when a lot of small towns rebuilt their sense of identity. They put up new schoolhouses, some with shiny WPA plaques on the walls. They built war memorials for the sons who hadn't come back from overseas. They started county fairs again, where people showed off their biggest pumpkins and their best pies, a kind of friendly proof that the land had forgiven them enough to grow things again. The radio brought in music from far-off cities. People tuned in for the Grand Ole Opry, hearing country singers tell stories that sounded a little too familiar. And when the weather forecast came on, no one dared talk over it, because the weather, always the weather, still ruled everything. Even though the Dust Bowl was technically over, you could say that it never really ended. It just lived on quietly, like a low hum in the background. For those who had migrated west and stayed there, the Great Plains became a memory, sometimes softened, sometimes hardened, depending on how they felt about having left. Some told their children that leaving had been the smartest thing they ever did. Others spoke of it with regret, wondering what might have been if they'd stayed and tried a little longer. History has a way of smoothing over the sharp edges of suffering, but it also has a way of holding on to certain images. Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935, the day the biggest storm of them all hit, became part of the collective memory. People who hadn't even been alive during that year still spoke of it, the way children speak of fairy tales. And yet, life went on. Wheat was harvested. Babies were born. The next generation learned to dance in gymnasiums that had been half buried by sand just a few years before. If you were sitting in one of those towns in 1950, maybe on a warm summer evening, listening to crickets outside your window, would you feel like you were living in a time of peace? Or would you still be waiting, just a little bit, for the wind to rise and the sky to turn dark again? Tell me in the comments. Would you have been the one to celebrate the quiet years, or the one still storing a flour and beans just in case? By the time the 1950s rolled around, the Great Plains were starting to look less like the edge of survival and more like the backbone of American agriculture again. Combines rolled across wide, flat fields that stretched so far you could lose sight of the horizon if the heat haze was bad enough. Tractors were bigger now. The days of horse-drawn plows were gone for good. Gasoline engines did what used to take whole families working sunup to sundown. Farmers could plant more acres, harvest more wheat, and keep up with the growing demand for bread in booming post-war America. New machines brought new confidence, maybe too much confidence. Some would say people began to believe that with enough horsepower and irrigation pipes, the land could be made to produce whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. The memory of the Dust Bowl was still there, but it was beginning to fade. Those who had been children during the storms were adults now, raising families of their own. They told their kids stories about the dirty 30s, but sometimes it sounded almost like folklore. The younger generation couldn't imagine the sky turning black in the middle of the day or shoveling sand out of the living room. It just didn't fit with the bright optimism of the 1950s, the shiny cars, the radios blaring cheerful music. Still, on certain windy days, you could see a shadow pass over the older folks' faces. They would look out the window a little too long, maybe step outside to check which way the dust was blowing. You could tell they still felt it in their bones. Technology was changing life in other ways, too. Electricity came to more rural areas, lighting homes that had been dark except for oil lamps just a decade earlier. Running water meant you could finally bathe without hauling buckets from the well. Refrigerators meant food lasted longer, which felt almost luxurious to people who had once buried meat in the ground to keep it cool. Small towns got new movie theaters, shiny chrome diners, and better highways connecting them to the outside world. Some kids began dreaming of leaving the farm altogether, heading to the city where there were factory jobs and neon lights. For some parents, this felt like progress. For others, it felt like a slow unraveling of everything they had rebuilt. The Dust Bowl generation tried to pass on its lessons, but not everyone was eager to hear them. Teenagers were more interested in rock and roll than in hearing about how their grandparents had lived on beans and cornbread for weeks on end. And maybe that was natural. Maybe forgetting, at least a little bit, was a sign that life had truly moved forward. People plant gardens on battlefields all the time. Towns rise on the ruins of disasters. But every so often, there would be a dry summer. The ground would crack, and the wind would pick up, and a little bit of fine dust would start blowing around. And then the stories didn't seem so far away anymore. In some towns, the local historical society began collecting interviews with survivors, worried that if they didn't, the memories would vanish entirely. Old-timers sat on porches or in church basements and told their stories one more time, their voices soft but steady, like they had practiced the words for years. Some spoke with a kind of pride. They had lived through it, after all. Others spoke with a kind of quiet sadness, like the dust was still in their lungs. But they all seemed to agree on one thing. It was worth remembering, because when you forget what hardship feels like, you're more likely to invite it back. If you were sitting at that kitchen table in 1960, listening to your grandparents talk about those storms, would you lean in and soak it up? Or would you roll your eyes and go back to listening to Elvis on the radio? Tell me in the comments. Would you be the one to write those stories down, or the one who thought the past belonged in the past? By the 1970s, it had been nearly 4 decades since the worst of the Dust Bowl. The Great Plains had been green for so long that some people had almost stopped worrying. Almost. The 1960s had been good to farmers. The post-war boom meant high demand for wheat, corn, and beef. Farmers bought bigger tractors, better combines, and new irrigation systems. The sound of machinery filled the fields every spring and harvest, and for a while it felt like technology had truly conquered the old fears. But the land is patient. It remembers. In the mid-1970s, the rain stopped coming as regularly. Nothing as dramatic as Black Sunday, not yet, but dry spells began to stretch longer than usual. The soil cracked under the sun. Crops withered earlier than expected. For a time, people reassured each other. Droughts came and went, they said. This was just another one. But as the years dragged on, those with longer memories began to shift uneasily. The word Dust Bowl started appearing in newspapers again. By the early 1980s, some areas were seeing dust storms again. Nothing like the black blizzards of the 1930s, but enough to sting the skin, enough to coat fence posts and porch steps in a fine powder. Farmers who had been children during the original Dust Bowl felt something cold and familiar in their chests. This time, they had technology on their side. Irrigation kept some crops alive. Chemical fertilizers boosted yields in fields that might otherwise have gone fallow. But technology is expensive, and when interest rates spiked and grain prices dropped, the farm economy began to crack. The 1980s farm crisis hit hard. Some farmers who had mortgaged everything during the boom years found themselves unable to make payments. Banks foreclosed. Auctions were held where neighbors bought tractors and equipment for pennies on the dollar, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of mercy, just to sell them back later. Small towns felt the pain. Stores closed. Schools lost students as families packed up and left, not because of dust this time, but because there was simply no money left to keep farming. And yet, through all of this, there was still that stubborn streak that had carried people through the 1930s. You could see it in the way neighbors showed up to help each other harvest before the bank came to take the farm. You could see it in the church suppers that kept getting organized, even when everyone knew the offering plate would be a little light that week. The Dust Bowl survivors, who were now old men and women, shook their heads, warning anyone who would listen not to push the land too hard. Some younger farmers nodded politely and went right back to plowing, but others took the advice to heart. They started using no-till farming methods, planting cover crops, rotating fields more carefully. Scientists got better at predicting drought patterns, though that didn't stop the wind from blowing when it wanted to. Still, there was a sense that people were at least trying to work with the land instead of against it. Culturally, these decades changed the plains in quieter ways too. More kids went to college, sometimes never coming back. Satellite dishes appeared in yards, bringing the wider world into living rooms. But even as the world modernized, there was still something timeless about driving past a lone windmill on a dusty road at sunset, hearing it creak and turn the way it had for 100 years. The Dust Bowl was now something most people only read about in history books. And yet, when the wind was just right, you could almost feel its ghost moving over plains, reminding everyone that this land had nearly been lost once, and could be again. If you were standing there in the 1980s, looking out at another season of dry, struggling crops, would you keep gambling on the weather, or would you pack it all up and head somewhere else? Tell me in the comments. Would you fight to hold on, or would you be the one to load the truck and look for a fresh start? By the 1990s, the Dust Bowl had moved from being something grandparents complained about at the dinner table to something school children learned about in social studies class. It was safely tucked away in the past, or so it seemed. This was the decade of documentaries, glossy history books, and oral history projects. Survivors were getting older, and historians rushed to record their stories before they were gone. Public radio ran features with soft piano music under interviews. High school teachers showed grainy black and white photos of men in flat caps standing in front of drifts of dust taller than a truck. For many, it was the first time they'd heard about how close the country came to losing the Great Plains entirely. And perhaps because the economy of the 1990s was good, with cheap food and low unemployment, it was easier to treat the Dust Bowl as something dramatic but safely distant, almost like a grim fairy tale. The towns that had survived the 1930s were still there, but thinner around the edges. The schoolhouses had fewer children now, and main streets had more empty storefronts. People were still farming, of course, but many farms were larger, owned by fewer families. Some of the survivors, now white-haired, sitting on porches and plastic lawn chairs, took a kind of wry pride in being living history. They told reporters about the day the sky went black and chuckled softly at the young people who didn't believe them. And yet, the wind still blew. That never changed. Through the 1990s, there were dry years and wet years, but nothing quite like the 1930s. That sense of security, however, was fragile. By the early 2000s, drought returned again to parts of plains, and once more there were headlines with the words Dust Bowl in them, always with a question mark, as though no one wanted to be the first to admit the thought. This time, scientists were talking not just about weather patterns, but about climate change. The idea that the land might be entering a new phase of dryness, not just a few unlucky years, made some people anxious. Still, life went on. Harvest festivals still happened. The Friday night lights still came on for high school football. People kept planting wheat, soybeans, and corn because that's what people did. At the same time, the cultural memory of the Dust Bowl became stronger than ever. Ken Burns released his famous PBS documentary in 2012, giving the story a kind of slow, cinematic dignity that suited it. Suddenly, people from Boston to San Francisco were talking about Black Sunday, the Okies, and the death of the American prairie. Ironically, this made some people on the plains roll their eyes. We lived through it. They would say, we don't need a TV special to remind us. Others were quietly grateful that the world still cared, that the struggles of their parents and grandparents hadn't been forgotten. What made the 1990s and 2000s interesting was that the Dust Bowl stopped being only a story about farming. It became a story about resilience. College students wrote essays comparing the 1930s to modern problems, recessions, hurricanes, even wildfires in California. In this way, the Dust Bowl became almost mythic, like a parable about the danger of pushing too hard against nature. It was no longer just a regional tragedy. It was a national warning. And the land, patient as ever, kept its quiet watch. The prairie grass swayed. The fence posts weathered. The windmill blades kept turning, creaking softly. If you were living out there at the turn of the millennium, would you see the Dust Bowl as an old wound that had finally healed, or as a warning that it could all happen again? Tell me in the comments. Do you think we really learned from history, or are we just waiting for the next great storm? The 2010s arrived quietly on the plains, as they tend to. There were no parades for a new decade, just the usual January wind sweeping along fence lines, rattling whatever wasn't nailed down. But the world had changed since the last serious drought. Smartphones buzzed with weather apps and drought monitors. Scientists could track soil moisture levels by satellite, mapping out whole counties in color-coded charts. Farmers knew, sometimes weeks in advance, what kind of season they might be facing. And yet, when the sky refused to rain, it felt very familiar. The drought that gripped much of the southern plains in 2011 and 2012 was the worst since the 1950s. Some said the worst since the Dust Bowl itself. Lakes shrank into muddy basins. Cattle ranchers sold off herds they couldn't afford to water. The ground cracked, and the wind kicked up clouds of dust once again. News outlets pounced on the story. Photos of withered cornfields and brown pastures ran side by side with black and white images from the 1930s. Just to drive home the comparison, the next Dust Bowl became a familiar headline. For people who had grown up hearing their grandparents' stories, it was unnerving. We swore we'd never see this again, one farmer told a reporter, looking out over a field that had been reduced to dust and weeds. But this time, there were tools the 1930s had never dreamed of. Irrigation systems ran night and day, pulling water from the Ogallala Aquifer to keep crops alive, though scientists warned that the aquifer was dropping dangerously fast. Crop insurance programs kicked in to keep farmers from going completely bankrupt. Federal drought relief funds arrived more quickly than they had in the past. Even so, some towns felt hollowed out by the stress. When you drive down a main street lined with empty buildings, you don't have to be a historian to know that the story of rural decline is still being written. Yet there was also pride. The Dust Bowl had become almost a badge of honor by now, a story families told to prove how tough they were, how deep their roots went. It was not uncommon to hear someone say, if my grandparents could make it through that, I can make it through this. That stubborn streak mattered. Farmers experimented with drought-resistant seeds. Ranchers shifted grazing patterns to protect what little grass they had left. Some communities revived old conservation methods. Windbreaks cover crops that had been almost forgotten. And while scientists kept warning about climate change, there was also a sense that the plains had always been a place of extremes. Blizzards, heat waves, droughts, hailstorms, they were all part of the deal. People didn't stay because it was easy. They stayed because it was home. Culturally, the Dust Bowl's legacy was everywhere. There were new novels set in the 1930s, new documentaries, even museum exhibits where you could sit in a darkened room and listen to simulated black blizzard winds. Schools use those materials to teach kids about both history and science, about what happens when you try to bend nature too far. And of course, the wind kept blowing. It has no memory, no nostalgia, no guilt. It just moves. If you were living there in 2012, standing under a sky that hadn't given rain in months, watching the horizon blur into a cloud of dust, would you see yourself as unlucky, or as part of a much older story, one that stretches back through generations? Tell me in the comments. Would you find comfort in that history, or would it make you worry about what's still to come? By the 2020s, the Dust Bowl was nearly a century in the past, but it was more present in people's minds than ever. The term itself had become shorthand for environmental catastrophe, invoked any time the word drought made the headlines. Documentaries, podcasts, and even social media threads kept the story alive. TikToks with captions like, "Did you know this happened in America?" would rack up millions of views, showing dramatic photos of men staring out at blackened skies. Younger generations found themselves fascinated, maybe because the idea of the land itself rebelling feels eerily relevant. Climate scientists warned that the future could bring even worse extremes. They said that by mid-century, some areas might experience Dust Bowl-like conditions again, perhaps even more severe. The soil is still fragile, after all, and the aquifer is not infinite. This left the plains in an odd place emotionally. On one hand, there was a quiet pride that they had already endured the worst nature could throw at them once. On the other hand, no one really wanted to repeat the experiment. Technology had transformed farming yet again. Tractors now drove themselves, guided by GPS satellites. Drones buzz over fields, spraying precisely where needed. Apps told farmers the exact soil moisture content of every square meter of land. It was impressive and strangely impersonal. But the wind does not care about GPS. It will always find the loose soil. In some places, ghost towns mark the edges of the old Dust Bowl region. Empty farmhouses with collapsed roofs, leaning barns. The kind of places photographers love to capture against a stormy sky. They stood as reminders that this land has never guaranteed survival to anyone. Culturally, the Dust Bowl became something of a litmus test for resilience. Politicians mentioned it when talking about climate legislation. Preachers referenced it in sermons about hardship and endurance. Even Hollywood occasionally dipped back into the imagery. Windswept fields, a lonely figure trudging along a dirt road, as if the Dust Bowl had become part of America's visual vocabulary. But the most important memory is still local. It's the grandmother telling her grandkids, "We had to stuff wet rags in the windows to keep the dust out." It's a museum guide showing a glass jar of dust collected in 1935 and explaining that this used to be a family's wheat field. The plains are not loud places. They do not demand attention. They are subtle, with beauty that reveals itself slowly. A sunrise that seems to stretch forever, a horizon so flat it looks like the edge of the world. And perhaps that is why the Dust Bowl still haunts them, because it was the one time the land itself became dramatic, violent, impossible to ignore. If you were standing there now, in the 2020s, watching a new storm form on the horizon, would you see it as just weather, or as a reminder that history never really ends? Tell me in the comments. Do you think the next century will see another Dust Bowl, or have we finally learned to live with the wind? So here we are, nearly 100 years after Black Sunday. The dust has settled, literally, but the story is still with us. The Dust Bowl was never just about dirt. It was about people, stubborn, frightened, hopeful people who face a land that refused to be tamed. It was about mistakes made in plowing up too much prairie grass, and about lessons learned the hardest way possible. It was about children growing up with dust in their teeth and adults wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake by staying. And it was about staying anyway. Today, when we look back, it's easy to imagine that we are different, that we are smarter, that we would never repeat those mistakes. But history has a way of humbling us. The land is still out there, quiet and wide and waiting, and the wind is still patient. If you ever visit the Oklahoma Panhandle or western Kansas, stand for a moment on an empty road at dusk. Feel the air. Listen to the wind. You may find yourself thinking of the people who once stood in the same spot, watching the same horizon, wondering if the rain would ever come. And maybe that is the real lesson. Not that we can conquer the land, but that we are always in conversation with it, learning, adjusting, trying again. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person I love talking to. Curious, thoughtful, willing to sit with history until it begins to breathe again. So tell me in the comments, if you had lived through the Dust Bowl, do you think you would have stayed or gone? Would you have been one of the stubborn ones who toughed it out? Or would you have hitched the wagon and tried for California? And if you enjoyed this slow drift through history, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps me keep making these calm, long explorations. Thank you for spending your evening with me, for letting the past settle gently around you like dust. The good kind this time. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.